To understand the Texas beer industry, we must first understand Germany. In the early 1800s, Napoleon tried to rule Europe. This caused an allied power to form around the Germanic kingdoms. These kingdoms of Germany united, and after the war they formed the German Confederation. This newly formed nation of 39 different kingdoms had been roughly based on the new American idea of a strong, united nation. It was formed around a single governmental body and had no appointed leadership like a president. The new Confederation was doomed at the start. This new institution of the Confederation had good intention, but still caused major problems with the German kingdoms, like high taxation and harsh laws on German people. This is where Frederick Ernest, one of the war heroes that fought against Napoleon's army, comes into play. Ernest fled Germany after charges of embezzlement was placed against him. Even then, he was still liked by the people of Germany that knew him. So he was able to flee to America. When he landed in New York, he met fellow German named Charles Fortrain. Together, they dreamed of a place westward for their families. So they left New York and went south to New Orleans. They heard about the Mexican state of Texas, where Sam Houston was working with American settlers with the government of Santa Anna to colonize the land. Once Frederick arrived in Texas, he wrote home. He wrote that the weather was winterless, that the land would take any crop's roots, and wild game was everywhere. The Ernest Letters, as it came to be known, was published in Germany. This caused a migration of Germans, and even Czechs, made the trip westward. Between 1830 to 1890, some 40,000 German and Czechs called this new land of Texas their home. One of those Germans, named Heinrich Christia, made Texas his new home. By the turn of the 1900s, the German wave was nearly dead.
That was a neat one because I stumbled across that coming home from Austin one time, and we were out camping on North Austin, and as I was coming home I saw the sign, the Christ Brewing at Monument Hill, right outside of LaGrange, I believe. Yes. And so I was like, man, what is there a brewery there? So I went and checked it out, and the cool thing about that place was that the guy who started it, he built his brewery on a bluff. And at the time, there really wasn't any lagers being made in Texas, just because there really wasn't a place for it. And I don't even think that the people that were making the beers here at the time, they knew that was actually part of the process. Like, they weren't familiar with that. So when the Germans came and they started lagering beers, and that's just fermenting, colder temperature, different yeast strains and everything. And the way he did his was in the caves at the bottom of at the base of the bluff. And it was just it's a great place, and if you've never been, you need to definitely go check it out, because it's a lot of history, a lot of cool little museum as you're walking through, but when you're walking the grounds and just like, man, this guy built a brewery at a really badass spot.
So the Christia Brewery is one of the earliest breweries in Texas. It was started by Heinrich Christia, a German immigrant, sometime in the 1860s or early 1870s, and was producing beer up until 1884. Christia moved to the area that was known as Monument Hill. In 1848, Heinrich Christia, who was a stonemason by training, helped construct the tomb that contains the remains of soldiers killed during the Dawson and Muir expeditions up on the Bluff, which would later become Monument Hill. So that's a separate historic site from the Christia Brewery State Historic. So Heinrich Christia was born in Gottgetrow, which is present-day Saxony area of Germany. His godparents was a stonemason, and so Heinrich Christia likely was an apprentice with that godparents. And eventually, probably in his early to mid-teens, attended a building trade school in Germany. In 1848, he brought that skill as a stonemason with him. Heinrich Christia moved to the United States a lot of people with specialized trades like stonemasonry or carpentry or any of these other skills are looking for ways to kind of build on those. And the United States offers a pretty good opportunity for exercising those talents. He is also probably becoming pretty familiar with stories of Texas. People are coming to that region promoting the idea of immigrating to Texas, settling Texas, where you can find cheap land, become pretty prosperous. And so there's a recruitment society, Adelsverein, that would bring Heinrich Christia and others to Texas to settle the area and to create a German colony, not quite a formal colony, but a German settlement in Texas. He settles in LaGrange area in 1849, buys the land that would eventually be where he settles his family in 1849. A few months prior, he built that tomb up on Monument Hill. Eventually, he builds the county jail. He builds a county courthouse. He helps build homes or parts of homes in the area and builds this pretty good reputation as a stonemason. So he secured 172 acres approximately in 1849 using funds that he probably acquired as a stonemason. And over the years, he's going to expand on that land to have a bigger parcel up here on the bluff. So just as base of operations for stonemasonry, since he lives above the bluff, that area below the bluff is kind of his quarry for securing stone that he's going to use to build his house. It's also the quarry that provides the stone for the jail and the courthouse and some of the other structures in town. He's probably doing a little bit of small-scale farming and using some of the land, but primarily it's just his base of operations for his stonemason. So it's tough to say when he kind of came up with this idea. He was very familiar with the concept of brewing and beer sales in Germany. His father had applied for a permit when he was about 15 years old to operate a beer bar out of his home and was unsuccessful in securing that. But perhaps that kind of inspired Heinrich Christia to pursue this idea of selling beer, making beer, because the way that beer unites people, brings people together to have these societal conversations. And so we see some early references to Heinrich Christia brewing beer in the 1860s. Tax records seem to indicate big improvements on the property in 1871 and 1872, which might suggest that that's when large-scale construction happened for a large commercial brewery. But there is some evidence to suggest that Heinrich Christia was doing some brewing before a large-scale brewery was constructed here. He had to adapt the landscape to meet the needs of the brewing operation. And so the brewery, the area where he's going to build his brewery has this natural valley, which is great for directing water flow using gravity, because water is the crucial element to brewing beer. At the top of the valley is a little spring head, and that spring head is going to be the source for the beer. And so he's going to adapt the landscape with stones and fill to build it into that valley and control that flow of water so that that spring water not only provides the source of the beer, but also helps create some of the cooling effects to create the lager beer that he's going to brew. So we are in the Christia Brewery vault or cellar. It is the last remaining defined room of the Christia Brewery. All the other rooms that helped create this 3-story structure fell victim to Mother Nature since 1884. So this is the last enclosed space that's part of the brewery. And it's critical to Christia's ability to create lager. So beneath this room is a tunnel that carries spring water, cold water from the spring head. And that tunnel is carrying that spring water. And as it evaporates, the cool air coming out of that tunnel up through the sides of the walls here are going to cool off this room, keeping temperatures pretty cool, temperatures that made it possible for Christia to ferment lager in here. At this time, most breweries in Texas are going to be importing hops from Europe. They would have come from Germany most likely. Depending on when the season is, you could get them imported through Galveston, or sometimes you might have to get them through Mexico, but they're all originating from Germany for the most part. In tough economical times or when shipping's hard, there's a plant around here called the wafer ash plant, and it's speculated that he might have used the wafer ash as a bittering agent to kind of replace the hops during those tough times.
German purity laws, yeah, they date back to, I don't know when that was, like 1500 and something, and there was a good reason for it at the time. You know, people were making all kind of stuff that could be dangerous and everything else, and so Germany is like, okay, we need to control some of these ingredients and how things are being made. And one, like wheat, they needed wheat for bread, not for beer. You know, it was a big part of it, so they kind of made these purity laws, which at the time only included 3 ingredients because they didn't really understand yeast was a thing just yet. And so it's cool when you go back and you read about all this stuff and learn the history about the purity laws. And so, you know, when you have water, your malts, your yeast, and your hops, those are the 4 things that can go into beer, which covers thousands of styles of beer. I mean, that's with those 4 ingredients, you can. There's already like over 5,000 styles of beer with just those 4 ingredients that are considered German beers. A hydroponic hop farm is what it was, and they're no longer around, unfortunately. Yeah, I just don't think that they were able to yield as much, and I'm not sure. I think Megaton did use some of their hops, but I'm not really sure. Yeah, ideally, it was an easy transition in case the marijuana laws changed. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, we're not growing hops anymore. But since that never happened, yes. But marketing Texas German beers, absolutely. I think it should be, there's so many ways to classify what to do, but having some sort of, almost like what the Brewers Association did, you know, putting the craft beer, it's like this is a Texas German beer, you know, upholding the principles of the purity laws and whatnot. I mean, that could be a good marketing. I believe he stuck with them because it was very important for the culture at the time to really stick to the German purity laws, and from there, I mean, that's like Lone Star came to be using the purity laws. Pearl, another one. You know, so you have these very historical breweries, that very well-known breweries that came because of the German immigration that happened.
Although not a traditional Texas beer brand, Anheuser-Busch took his father-in-law's company after the Civil War into the next stages for American beer. He was able to pasteurize beer, making it possible to ship long distances without spoiling the products. In the 1890s, Adolf Busch brought his business skills to Texas and built the Lone Star beer brand. It was the first mechanized brewery in the state. His beer was successful in Texas and the nation by selling 65,000 barrels a year, which also includes selling his ice-cold beer to Christia Pavilion and their bar in town. It was marketed as the national beer of Texas. Lone Star is owned by Pabst Brewery, but the Anheuser-Busch company still looked for a Texas-based beer with German roots. In the 1980s, Anheuser-Busch introduced the Ziegenbock brand to compete in the craft beer market against Shiner Bock.
The Germans have had a huge influence on Texas brewing, a huge influence on the United States brewing. Shiner was founded in the beginning of the 1900s and started as a German brewery. Prior to that, you may have had others that didn't survive, but Shiner would have been the first German brewery that at one point did maintain the German purity law.
They talk about like how he wore his hat was always crooked because that's where he hid his recipes.
Yeah, you're talking about Cosmos.
Yes, yeah. For the German style beers, I believe they do stick to that tradition. But then you have, you know, they've been coming out with a bunch of different things. Like they do the strawberry beer, you know, and all these different flavors that it's fairly recent, you know, in their history of creating other things. Because Shiner Bock, absolutely, you know, that was a staple for such a long time, and I'm sure that's the most beer produced. You can get that on airplanes flying from New York, you know, just Shiner Bock's everywhere, and it's a great, you know, that is a, from my understanding, it's just those 4 ingredients to make that beer. So sticking to the purity laws.
So Shiner started with Shiner beer, Shiner Premium, which they brought back as was blonde, and then they changed the name to Premium, and it never really kind of caught on again. And Bock was a seasonal. Bock is now their forefront, and they kind of remained a German brewery for quite a while, and they even did their anniversary beers leading up to the 100th anniversary, staying within that purity law. It wasn't until sometime in the last 5-10 years, beers like Shiner Cheer, Shiner Prickly Pear, started being introduced again in response to customer interest, customer demand, that they started brewing with things outside of the German purity law, those 4 ingredients. And again, it's I think a lot of people forget, but the brewing industry is a business. So you have to meet customer demand, and Shiner is doing that in some of those beers that no longer fit the purity law. Back when Shts was founded in 1962, we're actually celebrating our 60th anniversary this year, was homogenized. Prohibition killed most breweries. The few that remained open through Prohibition, either legal or illegal means, grew quickly and consolidation happened. So at the time, you had German influence and German inspired breweries like Shts that were producing, but from Germany, I would not be able to guess. I mean, many of the heritage brands that we carry, Beck's, St. Pauli Girl, are big now because they were big then. So I imagine something like that would be the first. Import beer didn't become as popular as it is, even in limited capacity, until the American craft beer revolution kind of began. Breweries like Live Oak out of Austin have a limited distribution footprint and do a good job with that. They would be the most notable. You've got some up-and-comers like Klaus that we're seeing on the shelves. Altstadt does a pretty good job as well. And then you have breweries that just brew exceptional German-style beer, but aren't a specifically German-style brewery. Real Ale does a really good job and has produced some pretty fantastic styles within that family. They actually just installed a new brew house that I believe was German by design. In talking with the owner when they got that installed, he was excited about the change that was going to make in beers like Hans Pils, which is a very hoppy German-style Pilsner, because of the efficiency and consistency they could maintain. Eureka Heights is definitely one that innovates based on a German style when they brew it, but is more traditional. They brew a Goza, which is a style of sour beer that originated in Germany, that because of the water profile had a pronounced minerality, salt content, but then it was also acidic. Many breweries now sour the beer and add salt to it to make a Goza. The history of most American styles is that somebody came from somewhere else and found out they couldn't brew what they wanted to. Cream ale kind of mirrored German lagers when they couldn't lager because of refrigeration. But they do an Oktoberfest, they do a Kolsch, they do a Pilsner called Wow Factor that's dry hopped with some more modern hops. So while a German style, they've modernized it. So,
which, it's a pretzel. But Eureka Heights, they do a lot of fun labeling, right? Their marketing is veered to be fun, a little goofy. I like it a whole lot. Plus, they make really good beers, so that helps as well.
And see the influence of the German immigrants in Texas. To look at that history, you're looking at the history of beer, you're looking at the history of Texas. And again, with us being a family-owned, founded and operated company in Texas, selling alcohol, you're kind of speaking to the history of Shts. American craft beer, kind of in general, and it was born even by kind of the founders of the revolution, of the movement, was born out of a desire for something new and different. They got tired of homogenized, everything was the same, and it was only 4 breweries. So they started brewing based on things that they'd experienced around the world. Well, now we've gotten to a point where craft beer has kind of explored all of the traditional areas of German, Belgian, English beer, and are now moving on to flavor added and hybrids and infusions. So the traditional beers, whether coming from the traditional areas or from here in Texas, are suffering in terms of sales because they're not keeping up with the new and different that the customers are looking for. So to answer your question, German beer, whether Texas born or import, does not do fantastically well, especially in comparison to something like IPA, which is the #1 style in the US and for us. But It has its fans, and it's definitely a sustained style of brewing and a sustained style of beer.
Sheer volume of pilsners that people buy, I mean, even from your Bud Lights, Miller Lights, and those are your big macro breweries. What are they making? What's the majority of people drinking? They're drinking the lighter beers, and a lot of those are based upon a German recipe. Stouts, although I love them in the summertime, it's pretty warm around Texas for a good chunk of the year, and so they consider winter being like stout season, so that's when you start seeing their releases and all that. The English ales never really quite took off. Now there were more of those being made in the 90s when the first wave of brew pubs opened up in Houston, and everybody had like an English pale ale or something like that, because the American pale ale hadn't quite taken off as much, and it wasn't known, even though Sierra Nevada was putting theirs out at the time and still one of the best beers ever made. But the English styles have just never quite have taken off as much. But they're a little drier. It just doesn't really fit the profile of what we like in our foods and in our drinks.
But their beer in the yellow iconic can called Shiner Bock is still the most popular beer they produce today. In Houston, you can find a small micro pub that produces a crisp, clean German beer, and sit back and enjoy the malty richness that they strive hard to produce.
I wanted a kind of a strong-sounding German name, and we came up with Klaus because I like that name. It also happens to be the name of my son, so it was kind of a 2-for-1, I guess. So that's really basically it. That was our reasoning behind it. Yeah, on my dad's side, the last 100 years, my mom came here in the 60s. So I'm kind of first generation, on my mom's side. And so she came here, lived here for several decades, and then has now moved back to live over in Germany. What got me into making beer was I experimented with making beer in college, homebrew style. So, and I really liked doing it. And I grew up kind of in the German culture, so I was surrounded by beer a lot. And I just took an interest to it. And that's basically what kind of started the whole thing. I was self-taught, so there was issues with flavor profiles, body profiles, and then as the more you do it, the more you kind of hone what temperatures you like, what hops you like, when to add them, water salts that you can introduce later on. When you feel a little more comfortable with that. So those were the real challenges. Because when you're self-taught, it's kind of a crapshoot. You just you make something according to what a book says or a recipe says and hope it turns out okay. I started homebrewing again in earnest with better equipment several years before we did this project. And so those recipes translated into some of the ones we do now. Trying to start Klaus itself as a project, of course there's always, the money side. We had to get investors involved, and that was the main thing. And then sourcing all the equipment from reliable sources. That was another challenge for us. I was able to visit the manufacturer of our actual brewing equipment, and that was a plus. So we got to see that firsthand, see the manufacturing facility. But that was the two main challenges. Once we got the funding together, then we could move. Then we felt a lot more comfortable moving forward with the other things. It's European standard. It's a European style brew house of the way we make the beer. Of course, I went to St. Arnold for years before there was much anything else here. Karbach, a few of the smaller ones as they popped up. And then as far as in Germany, I couldn't name all the ones I've been to. Some of the bigger ones, Weihenstephan. My stepfather actually was a chemist for a big brewery in my mom's hometown, which is Meisel's. They focus on Hefeweizen style predominantly, but they do offer some other stuff. And he was a chemist there, so that was a good insight into the business. He had good connections for me to do research. He was able to get me into Weinstefan to do a tour of their lab, of their brewery, and it was all great information for my research that I was doing. The base of what most everybody does is has a German influence on it, maybe British. But Americans tend to be a lot more experimental. Yeah, so all of our hops are German grown. We import or buy from an importer all of the hops that we use in our beers, unless we're doing something region specific. We'll do some British beers, which we use all British ingredients, malt, hops, water profile, thing like that, yeast as well. And so that's the only time we stray away typically from the German side, is that we're trying to emulate another region's beer, whether it be British or Belgian or American. So it's out for maybe a month and then that's it. Now there's a lot of nuances, really strict nuances in the beer purity law that are more modern that we don't or can't follow for technical reasons. But as far as the four ingredients, the way we lager, the way we brew, the way we carbonate, all of that stuff is pretty much to the exact standards of the purity law. So about 12 or 13 hour days on a double batch day. Then it ferments. Of course, the lagers ferment slower. We do a lot of lagers. They ferment slower, anywhere from 7 to 10 days usually. Then we'll cold crash it, and then we'll move it most of the time into a lagering tank, depending on our process schedule. And then we'll leave it in there for usually at least 4 weeks. Yeah, sometimes a little bit longer, depending, again, on our schedule. Sometimes it stays in there a little bit longer, which is better, sometimes up to 8 weeks. And all the clarity comes from the aging process, the lagering process. We don't use any filters or anything like that. Hefeweizens are a lot quicker. They're an ale. They ferment out within a few days usually. Then we'll condition them for another week to try to mellow it out a little bit. And so we usually push them out from start to finish in about 3 weeks. Our most popular is our Helles, our Munich-style Helles. So, and then maybe secondly the Dunkel, which is also a lager, but on the darker, maltier side. But we do a Marzen style year-round, so it's available. It's a good amber lager, not on the dark side, not on the light side. Got a nice malt backbone to it, so it's a very popular beer here in the tap room. I would say last year we did over 600 barrels of production. 20 to 30% sales out of our tap room and beer garden, and the rest is market sales, whether it be kegs or cans. So we have a lot of keg accounts for draft beer, and then we have 3 flavors in cans that we sell to a few retail accounts, bars that like cans, but right now mostly to the grocery stores. Yeah, so I really like to kind of promote the German feel. So that's why our furniture is beer garden style, a German beer garden style. Our decorations are German. We have a lot of steins, a lot of German hats, pipes, things like that. We also do several events every year. Of course, an Oktoberfest, which is our biggest event. We do a May Fest in May, usually the first weekend of May. So that'll be coming up. And then we do a lot of traditional German things during the festival. So we have German entertainment. So we have a German band, a German style band. And then we do activities like Hammerschlagen, which is driving the nail into the big chunk of wood as a competition. So sometimes we'll have German dancers come out and do a little performance for about half an hour. Of course, we're in our full regalia of lederhosen and dirndls. And so everybody's having fun, you know. Beer festivals are starting to ramp up slowly again, so we will be doing those as they come along. So far, I want to say it's the Pickle Festival in Kingwood. It's every September. Yeah, so we sell our beer out there. That's one of the venues where we actually sell the beer at. the guests will request a German food truck. And so they'll come out for that. We do the German American Chamber of Commerce Oktoberfest in the fall as well. And of course, Berlin does that, caters that. So that's another big private event we have in the fall. Today we do a Stein night. So if you bring your own Stein, it has to be a Stein, can't be just any cup. Whether it be glass, metal, or ceramic, it has to be a Stein. Up to 1 liter, we'll fill it for $6 all night. So that's probably the best deal in town that I can think of. And everybody comes and shows off their Steins. Some of them will bring much larger Steins just to show, but we can only fill it up so much. We do have Steins for purchase here. So we have the 1 liter glass Steins. And it does, any purchase of a glassware from here, we include the first fill. So a liter fill on your first Stein is pretty good. I think the beer culture is still very strong in Texas, especially more so than others, depending on geography where you're at in Texas. But as far as I know, most every brewery I've seen will offer, you know, at least 1 or 2 traditional German styles. Everybody will typically try to do an Oktoberfest in the fall, you know, as a celebration. So I think the culture is still pretty strong.
So it's a beautiful view. People come here to picnic, to enjoy the view. There's 1.5 miles or so of hiking trails. We offer education programs, special guided tours, special events here to enjoy both of those historic sites. So we partner with 2 organizations. So one is the German Society of Fayette County, which is localized German immigrants who support us for different programs. And then the German Texas Heritage Society, which is based out of Austin, and we partner with them on some special events as well, especially ones that kind of preserve German language. This is a way for them to kind of showcase the ways in which German heritage has evolved since Germans first immigrated here in the 1800s, and how German immigration is part of Texas culture today. So there's lots of breweries that have really enjoyed the idea of the Christia story and who have kind of capitalized on this idea. They've looked at the historic documents, the historic photographs that Heinrich Christia left behind, or that other folks have left behind related to the Christia story. And a few breweries have brewed beers inspired by the history of Christia Brewery. We will launch our inaugural Bluff Schützenfest. And Bluff Schützenfest is a celebration of the different events and programs that Schützenverein hosted back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Back then they were hosting dances, holiday celebrations, musical performances, family gatherings, picnics, along with general shooting competitions. And of course, at any of these celebrations, there's a wide variety of beer. When Christia's brewery was in operation, it was his beer. Afterwards, there's other local beers that are being enjoyed at these celebrations. And so in May 2022, we're celebrating that concept with Bluff Schützenfest. And so we'll have all sorts of activities during the day that celebrate German immigration and German heritage in Texas. And then we'll cap that off in the evening with an event called Texas History on Tap, which celebrates the history of beer in Texas and the history of Texas in beer. And so we've got Texas breweries from across the state of Texas that are sharing beers inspired by Texas history or Texas identity at that tasting event.
I think right now we're definitely seeing a trend of the lagers, the pilsners, and the nice, easy, lighter beers, right? I think we're definitely seeing a trend move that direction, and which is why you're seeing a lot of breweries, you know, adding some lagering tanks and adding that to the tap list. It is something that I love IPAs. That's what pretty much West Coast IPAs are still my favorite, but I will have West Coast IPA, and then it's like, all right, let's look for some Pilsners to drink. Yeah, or a lot of times when I go to a brewery, I will drink a Pilsner first. I'll just order the Pilsner, and then, or when they're lagers, I'll order it. Because that'll tell you a lot about the brewery as well. Yeah, if you taste a lager that It's like, man, there's some weird flavors in this.
German.
Yeah, or some things that you can get. There's different off flavors come in just the brewing process, and even though you're using the same 4 ingredients, then it's kind of it's like, okay, well, what are the other beers going to be like? If they're putting this out to be their lager, that's supposed to be nice, bright, clean, crispy, all that, and it's just off, then what's these other beers going to be like that you can hide flavors in? Because if we do not grow the amount of beer drinkers, then everyone's just going to struggle. There will be some that succeed very well, but when you're talking about a small percentage of breweries in Texas that are actually succeeding well compared to the smaller ones that are going to have struggle just to have people in their tap room, and then all of a sudden they have a great weekend because that mob of people showed up at their tap room. There has to be just more collaboration. It needs to start with the breweries marketing each other and marketing the industry much better.
In a can or in a bottle, draft, what type, and then what style?
Oh, well, me personally, I'll take a draft beer any day over, like straight from the tap, like from the brewery. That's going to be the exact way that brewer wants their beer to be. The problem is when it gets put in a keg and it leaves a brewery, you never really know what's going to happen and how well it's going to be taken care of. I've had some really good beers at some establishments that did not taste good. And it had nothing to do with the beer, it has to do with the establishment.
I mean, I'll take my beer any way I like it. I love Texas beer, and there's something about, how this job has influenced the way that I drink beer and the ways that I really appreciate the ways brewers have taken history and kind of incorporated that into the products that they're brewing. And so it's pretty exciting to see that the craft brew scene that is today is very much the legacy of these small brewers like Heinrich Christia that were doing small scale brewing, trying to serve their local networks in the 1880s, that we're still doing that today with these great beers that Texas brewers are doing.
And it's not just like German beer, Texas German beer brands. Everyone comes in, right? Like if you're doing English beers, those companies will probably come out too.
I think so. So just beers that kind of embody Texas history. And I mean, German immigrants are one of many immigrant groups that came to Texas. It's the one group that we get to highlight here, but Czech Texans, Mexican Texans, Anglo-Texans all have these traditions that we celebrate, but traditions that include drinking. And so there's other ways that we celebrate their beer styles that came to Texas as well.
Find a way to take the fun out of beer, I've done it. And in many of my classes that I taught here on any number of topics, including the birth of Oktoberfest and some of the influence of German history on the beer. One thing that I make important to say, and I would love to be the way that people remember me, is if you like it, it's correct. If you like it ice cold out of the bottle, perfectly fine. If you like it closer to room temperature out of a glass that you can perceive more of it, perfectly fine. How do I prefer it? It's situational. If I just got finished doing yard work, I want ice cold, fresh out of the can. If it's something I'm sitting with for a period of time and I want to really experience it, I pour it closer to room temperature and I spend some time with it, let it warm up and see what it does.
At the end of the day, Texans, no matter what nationality you are, enjoy the taste of an ice-cold beer. There are hundreds of breweries marketed in Texas. Many of them have a German-inspired beer on tap, and some only produce German purity law beers. Economies move by immigration, and this is just one small forgotten history of a prideful people. If it wasn't for Frederick Ernest and his letters back home, the Texas beer economy would be vastly different. Americans love our beer, and we take pride in producing, shipping, and selling our favorite brands. Texans alone consume around 35 gallons of beer per year. However, it is the small micropubs that really push the boundaries of the creativity in brewing and crisp, clean beer to capture just a few of those gallons.